Hello, everyone. Our guest for today is joining us from South Africa. I will invite him to introduce himself shortly, but before doing that, I would like to thank anyone who will watch this interview and who will join us now as the interview is being streamed. I would also like to thank those who will watch this later as a recorded event. Thank you very much for your time and for your interest. I will now invite our guest, I beg your pardon, to introduce himself. So please tell us about yourself.
First, I want to thank you for this opportunity. I've been following your program for quite a while, and I think you're doing excellent work. And I see there's quite a few of my fellow South Africans that has been guests on your program. So thanks a lot, very much. It's a wonderful opportunity, and I think it's wonderful for composers and the music of our times in general. My name is Marius Coetzee, and I'm employed by the Udean School of Music at the University of the Free State in the city of Bloemfontein in South Africa. It's really in the middle of the country. And I'm Innovation and Developmental Manager at this conservatory, which entail quite a bit of many things. So I'm a bit of a jack of all trades and master of none. Apart from my main job, I'm also the artistic director and manager of the OSM Camerata, which is our flagship chamber orchestra, as well as the convener of the Lisbeth Strumberger International Organ Learning Chair. So my work is a little bit of a mixed role. Previously, I worked for 8 years in Finland at the University of Jyväskylä for Applied Sciences, where I was responsible for one of the first the European joint degrees, and in the fields of international music management. That degree was a collaboration between Norwegian, British, Dutch, and a Finnish university. And I specialize mainly in conservatory innovation management. Here in Bloemfontein, I'm busy with policy, internationalization, basic marketing, recruitment, and then, of course, the strategy of the Department of Music, which is now known as the Udean School. So I think that covers it all.
Okay. So thank you very much for joining us today. And thanks for the introduction that you have given to yourself and to what you do as part of the orchestra and as part of being in charge of innovation. Something occurred to me when I saw innovation. I was wondering, how do you innovate? This is just a side question that occurred to me. If a composer is working on early music, what does innovation look like? Just very quickly.
I think that's a difficult one. You got me now. Are you referring now to contemporary music or historically informed practice?
So we're talking about early music in particular, because there's a type of music or a form of music referred to as early music where you see the performances on the lute. And
I don't think you innovate that. I think the only possibility to innovate in that context is to really present it and facilitate it. And yes, because in South Africa, that's actually not so common. It's mainly in Cape Town where they really focus on that under the auspices of Erik Dippenaar and at the UCT Department of Music, the South African College of Music. Then they have also a specialization of old music at the University of Stellenbosch. But we usually present it annually, so we have guest lectures that's coming in, and then they're working on a concentrated matter to do that. So innovating that per se, except if you have people like the South African composer Hans Hiesen, who's collaborating and integrating all kinds of old music and new music, and also African elements in that. But per se, I don't have very much experience in that.
Okay, can we talk now about the Udean School of Music, Camerata? Can you tell us something about that? I know you've given a quick introduction, but can you tell us a bit more about what it involves? What is there?
When I was employed as the innovation manager, and I was starting to following or compiling my strategy, so to say, I really was looking for something to serve as a catalyst for excellence. And I was thinking to position the orchestra as the heart of my innovation strategy. So the orchestra was positioned about a year after I started at the Udean School of Music. And a part from creating really a catalyst of excellence. At the same time, I wanted to position the orchestra for the music of our times, because I saw that really as a weakness in South Africa. I lived previously, as I said before, in Finland, where modern music is very common. In fact, and not only modern music per se, but the Finnish music is just as common. I think that's quite a tendency in all the Scandinavian countries, referring to Norway, Denmark, Iceland, and Norway. So I wanted to do something similar to really introduce students and lecturers alike about to the possibilities of the music of our times, and of course the South African music per se, which is really not a first priority in our country.
Right. So this takes us to a particular subject that I want us to dwell upon, I guess, for a long part of this interview. When students study music, or conductors study, or composers compose music, I've noticed, or when they study rather, I've noticed that they are taught to learn, they are taught they're taught established music, let's put it that way, what you might refer to as classical music, or what I talked about earlier, early music. And there is an expectation. Let's say you're an opera singer. There are certain areas you're supposed to know. It's almost like a standard. And I listen to what you do at Odeon, you call it, right? The Odeon school. Yes. And I'm just wondering, so what happens to this standard that's now been recognized as the international body of work that all students should know? What happens to your students? What happens to your conductors? What happens to the opera singers if there's a lot of effort being put into learning what you refer to as modern music? And also, as an aside, what is missed if they don't study or work with modern music?
Well, I think if you go back to the word conservatory, it means to conserve. And I think that's the problem in South Africa. There's way too much focus on the standard classical repertory. And the first thing I have to emphasize that the OSM Camerata is a complementary ensemble. So we have many other orchestras where the students really learn the standard repertory. So we are in a wonderful position that we have the Free State Youth Orchestra, which is also serving as our university orchestra, and they do all the standard repertory, and they do also some other works. Then we have a string orchestra, the Odeon Symphonia, conducted by Professor Anne-Marie van der Westhuizen, and they also mainly, once in a while, they will do something modern, but they concentrate on the Handel, Mozart, Greek standard repertory as well. Then we are very blessed to have the Free State Symphony Orchestra, which is an 80% professional orchestra, and then our top students play in this orchestra as interns. And last year, I forged a new collaboration with the Cape Town Philharmonic Orchestra as an additional value-added ensemble, where our students are going, let's say, for a week, where they play with the orchestra, they rehearse with the orchestra, and then they play the full symphony season for that week with the orchestra. So it's very important that this orchestra is something extra. It's not at the cost of standard repertory.
Okay. And is anything going to be missed if the modern music is not learned or performed? The thing is, you used the expression excellence earlier. You talked about that you were brought in to manage innovation, and you talked about the shoot for excellence. That was your goal. That is your goal. There are certain spaces you get involved in where you discover that what is coming out of Africa is not considered excellence. You talked about standard repertoire. When somebody hears standard repertoire, they know the names to expect.
Yes.
African composers don't generally seem to fit into what standard. So exactly what are you doing if you are shooting for excellence and you are performing the works of African composers? Imagine you meet these people who say, oh, Africa has nothing to offer. Forget it. We have a standard repertoire. What would you say in response? How does your work fit in?
Well, I hope that the standard and the product and the results of the Camerata will speak for itself. And in fact, it did quite a bit because I had tremendous resistance. So what you say is definitely true. As soon as it coming to the music of our times, and if it comes to South African music, there's definitely immediately a resistance. And I didn't only have resistance from the students, but also from my fellow colleagues
From
who's
the
supposed
students.
to be high. Students, definitely, yes.
Tell us
Yes.
about that. That's interesting.
Yes, yes. It took some time, and it really takes some time to develop it. And we had a very interesting experience. In 2013, we were invited to the International Conservatory Festival in Russia. Now, in my opinion, the Russian school is really the foundation of the old classical music. They don't play anything else except standard repertory and then the Russian masters. That's what they do. So it was quite a risk. And it was fascinating because we played an all, when we had our gala concert in the Glazunov Hall at the Rimsky-Korsakov Conservatory. We played an all South African music program. That's from top to bottom. And it was fascinating. Immediately when we started, we had a piece by Stefan Schrevier, which is a wonderful South African composer that passed away about 3 years ago at the age of 90. And he was the first white South African that started to really do some serious introspection into what is African music, what is South African music, and he combined a kind of Afropean synthesis, combining all elements. I think towards the 80s, he made a radical aesthetic change. He was a lecturer actually at Peabody Conservatory in America, and when he returned to South Africa, he called always it his Damascus experience. So he was one of the first white South African composers that really had a serious investigation and started to look and dissect and investigate the local material which we have. And we performed a work there called Bushman Songs, referring to the Khoisan and Khoi people, which he based with a vocalist and orchestra, and he really fused all the typical harmonical elements of the Bushman music into the program. And we performed the cycle. It consists of about 7 miniatures. And the moment we finished, people stood up and there was a tremendous, we had a so-called standing innovation. Okay, that's not something you would like to brag about, but we were just that's in Russia. And I think that speaks for itself, that people are able to define quality when they hear it, irrespective of the background of the music.
But that is a challenge for Africa across different spheres, though.
Yeah.
Music, or in addition to music, it is a
Yes.
challenge. So, I wouldn't say redefine excellence, but how do you push through that resistance, that doubt? If people have been used to not getting any quality from you, or anything rather from you, and they've decided this is the definition of quality and this is the definition of the best standards, how do you say you fit into that standard, or do you create your own set of standards for measuring what is good?
I think it's a little bit, if I may use the expression, a little bit of a mixed grill. So first we start to have the best possible conductors, which is very, very important. And a few years ago, we employed also a string clinician, so that we can really lift the standard on any level, and also use all the sectional lectures to have the best possible lectures. We also have a program where we use young South Africans that have a career in Europe. That's very sad because so many of our top South Africans leave the country as soon as they are finished. All these days, they're leaving already at the age of 15. Just the beginning of this year, we lost the previous concertmaster of the OSM Camerata, who's now in America at the, what's it called again? It's a very well-known school. For a moment, it left me. So that's the foundation that we try to build. Then in the selection of music, it's very important. So 90% of the music that I choose is so-called choreographed or composed on the ensemble, because we have also the problem that we don't have, for example, all the typical Western instruments. We don't have this year any oboes. We don't have a French horn. So we have to make compromises. So when I speak to a composer and I commission work, I tell him, this is exactly what we have. This is what we have in the percussion section. We have all these possibilities. Choreograph literally the work on what we have. So I think that's also, otherwise you're always making compromises if you performing works and you don't have the exact instruments, and you have to use a sax in the place of a horn, or you have to use a bass clarinet in to replace a bassoon. So I think that's shortly my kind of modus operandi, to make sure that you have good quality, so that the composer is really composing or choreographing the new work on the ensemble. So he knows exactly what is the ensemble's possibilities, what they can do, what they cannot do, and he's directing his compositional process on what we have.
Okay, so this program is centered around African composers. So what we are doing today, and what I work on today. So you've talked about the effort that you put in to ensure that there's excellence in the orchestra. Let's talk about excellence in the work that is being performed. How do you judge? What is your standard? How do you decide this composer has given us a piece of work? They've suggested that we perform it, but we cannot because it doesn't meet our standard. And who is the gatekeeper for that?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question, because it's very difficult to define that. You depend on the press. I think you depend on the reaction of the audience. You depend really on the reviews and general comments. It's not something that you can just define in a very empirical way. And we sometimes make mistakes because it's the music of our times. It's in a way quite experimental. And last year I included a piece in the repertoire, and it was very clear that this work didn't work. So it is in a way like a learning incubator. You have to also experiment, especially if you give a commissioned work to a new composer. You're never 100% sure if it's going to work or not. So it's a little bit of a dice.
Is the responsibility with the composer, or are you concerned do you see yourself as perhaps what some may call a gatekeeper, and therefore you have this weight of responsibility that can break or make a career?
Yes, I would say that. And of course, I work very closely with the conductor. So we decide together. I make a decision. I make a list every year of the repertoire that I have in mind. And we, for example, now, unfortunately, due to the corona, our whole year is messed up. But we were supposed to start now with 8 new works. And now they are studying it themselves, and she will meet them, I think, next week for the first time, where she will work with them individually via video. But of course, it's very difficult. Yes. And it is definitely a dicey situation, because you never know 100% whether everything is going to work or not. So I have also a few people's advice that I always often asked when I'm compiled the repertoire. I have a discussion with some of our previous guest conductors, some other South African musicians, and some fellow composers in the country. So I think you must be open. It is a dice, but you must try your best to make sure that you really reach excellence. And sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. Because I think the compilation of the repertoire, for example, of last year was actually quite good, but this one piece just didn't work. And you must make it work, because it's not so easy to just replace one work. So yes, it's a very interesting question. It's something that we can elaborate on, very much so.
Because I'm pretty sure after watching this, some composers, I beg your pardon, may say, well, let me reach out to him and send him my work and see what happens. But and by the way, that feeds another question I was wondering about. Do you invite composers to submit? Do they submit to you randomly? How does this work?
In the beginning, I really invited specific composers that I like, and of course also work that I know, and of course also work being new music that's not been performed. I mean, quite a few of the works that's not commissioned has been performed only once, and it's filed somewhere. Nobody knows about it. Some stuff that I discovered as a student, that I had as a student, that I rediscovered and then perform. But slowly, since the orchestra became more known within the South African community, we have more and more people that send commissions. And that for me is really a positive situation. And of course, we cannot perform everything, but we try our best to accommodate that. And my colleague, Dr. Dandre Strydom, initiated 2 years ago the International Clarinet Extravaganza. And for the Clarinet Extravaganza, there's always a national, or in fact, it could be international because it's open to everybody. There's a composition competition that's open to compose for a clarinet concerto. And we had a very first successful piece called the Clarinet Concertino by Keith Moss, a South African composer that's lately living in Auckland in New Zealand. He's actually working for the Auckland Symphony Orchestra. So he was one of the first commissioned works. And we just at the beginning of this year had the second International Clarinet Extravaganza, and we received the next work by a student that's now a master student, Chesney Palmer. So that's definitely something we would like to tackle next year.
Okay. The Chamber Orchestra has premiered 25 new works by South African composers since its inception. Do you remember when it started, by the way? Do you remember the year?
2012.
Oh, so 25 already.
Yes.
Okay. And these are mainly or works of South African composers only. Are you looking to expand beyond South Africa?
Well, it's not only music. I think we've done quite a bit of works by other composers as well. And last year we started to do, for example, the beginning of our season, we started with Bach's first concerto, number 1. Just that the students have a more coherent experience, and we had also international guest lecture from Professor Karen van Heerden from Austria. So I lean more, in the beginning, I think I was a bit of a radical. So we only did modern music. And later we do, I would say about 10% to 5% of also a little bit of other music. And we always include some music. For example, last year we did work by a very well-known composer by the name of Petris Vasks. He is from Lithuania, Latvia, in fact. I met him in Latvia. And we also did work that's not very well-known by Bela Bartok.
Oh, Bartok, okay. So this just coincides with a question by someone who's watching us now. He asked, does OSM Camerata do compositions from other countries? I suppose you've addressed this question, unless you want to add something else to that question in answer to him.
Yes, I would say yes. Primary focus on South African composers, but we do indeed also do works by other composers. And if there's any ideas or suggestions or submissions, by all means, we will definitely consider it. Definitely.
Okay, but before you consider people's works, I suppose the question of funding has to arises. I was wondering, do the composers pay or do they contribute to the orchestra? How are you funded?
It took me many years. We started with absolutely zero. And these days I get funding from the university. Last year, for the very first time, I got some substantial money from the university, but previously I had to raise every single cent. I'd also a previous head of department who was very supportive, so he also gave me something. But these days we're in pretty much a good situation. So we also even able the young composers to pay them honorarium, which of course it's a poor man's loan. It's not a very good fee. I would have liked to give them triple the amount, but at least we can pay them something, especially if it's young composers. In South Africa, we are very fortunate to have the South African Music Rights Organization. So when it's a rather large work or it's a established young composer, you can commission a work via them, and then you can really pay the composer a proper fee.
Okay.
And I really hope we can improve that also with the young composers. So with the young composers, I also see it as a launching of their career, you know. But we never expect any composer to do a work for free.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. Well done. you seem to have hinted that finances were a bit of a challenge at the beginning. Were there any other challenges when you started?
I tell you, it was a nightmare the first 2 years. There was resistance from my colleagues. There was resistance from the students. There was resistance from the conductor of the main symphony orchestra. Everybody had a problem with it. And I must say the last 3 years, we're really in calm waters. And it's also wonderful when the students come to me and say, hey, did you hear this? Or I discovered this composer, or listen to this. So I think it's a process.
Okay. What is the definition of modern music, by the way? I mean, if somebody composed something in 1970, what's the definition of modern music?
Yeah, it's difficult to say, hey? You are too sharp. I think you must look, of course, it depends, of course, on the year the composer was born, and then their style. But these days, it's so difficult because you will have a work composed very recently that's not sounding according to preconceived ideas of music of our times. So that's quite a controversial subject. I remember when I was living in Finland, I don't know if you're familiar with the music of Nordic composers. It got to a stage that it became really unlistenable. I think they had a kind of an aesthetic ceiling at some stage. And I remember when we were forming the first joint masters, there was an incident in Iceland, in Reykjavik, where the students really resisted the kind of preconceived idea of what is so-called modern music. And one of the students that was also an exchange student with us in Finland said, why must modern music always be ugly? So that was quite an interesting situation for me. It's not something that you can just define, because you might have a composer that's composing today, a young person that's composing in a new classical style or new romantic style, or you might have a composer that's really focusing on the heritage of his background. We are fortunate to have also the Odeon String Quartet in our department, which is the only professional string quartet in the country that's continuously working. And they're releasing a new CD, and they gave the composer Mukale Kwapeng a work where he focused on the ancient string techniques. Unfortunately, I don't have the notes now with me, so I can't give you the backgrounds. But he really works in a very traditional element. That's really the foundation of his work. And then he's reworking it more into a kind of contemporary genre, if I may call that.
Yes.
So I think that's not something that you can easily define, because every person have their own style. It was also quite interesting. About 3 years ago, we had the SASRM Congress. That is the National Congress of Music Research, of musicology, a very dynamic and forward-looking institution. And there was a very competent South African composer. He is lecturer at Wits, and there was questions, but he is a black man. Why is he composing in a Western style? And he was extremely irritated by that, because he said what is coming within is a very natural response. He doesn't want to be forced to compose in an African manner. So I think it's a very subjective and a very personal experience. How your own palette is working.
Just to find out, was he an African? I think that's also very important.
Yes. Andile Kumalo, he studied at Wits in Johannesburg, and then he did his postgraduate studies and his PhD in Germany. And of course, he was there composed to very different styles. And he was rather irritated by that.
That's really interesting. That's a really interesting topic. Are you worried that some people might be disadvantaged because of the style in which they compose? I talked about early music earlier. There are some composers who are alive today who like to compose in that style, but if their music is heard, could it be that an orchestra might say, no, we want modern music, not early music, and then that composer's work does not get performed?
Yes, I think it happens quite often.
Oh, no. Oh, gosh.
And people have so many different opinions. I mean, like Professor Hendrik Hofmeyr, that was a few weeks ago on your program, is composing in a very interesting manner. Do I dare to say it's in a way new romantic? It has elements of new romanticism. He actually told me just I must not try to put him in a little block. So, but I would say he's currently, by all ways, the most commissioned composer of all South African composers. And there's a lot of criticism against that. And we also receive criticism. One person said, but it's just pastiche. It's not good music. So I think there's quite a lot of controversy. And personally, I think it's wonderful that we can work in this melting pot, especially in South Africa, where we have so many different cultures, from the ancient First Nations to Xhosa, Zulu, Afrikaans, English. We really have a very eclectic melting pot. And I think everybody has the right to compose what really speaks to him and the kind of aesthetic perception or identity which he prefers, or he or she prefers to compose.
And you take your orchestra to different parts of the world. You don't just perform in South Africa, right?
Well, we have been only once abroad when we went to Russia. And before Corona, the idea was to go to Belgium and to the Netherlands this year with an all South African program. So I'm not sure if that will realize. It depends on so many things. But if not this year, definitely next year. So we may make sure the program is excellent quality. So we have a whole range of different elements, from integration, fusion, new works, just about a little bit of everything. In fact, I asked Professor Hans Rosenskoen, who used to be the composition lecturer at the University of Stellenbosch, to rework his work, Fireball. That was based on a text by Sidney Clouds, and it was based on the basic life of the Bushman and the Kalahari Bushman. Magnificent work. I think it was one of the first so-called vocal painting choral works, and is currently orchestrating it for us with a soloist. A magnificent work that's really focusing on the daily life, and he's using all kinds of sound palettes, words like skla and elements like Kalahari, Kalahari, and all kinds of the language components of the Khoisan language, which has quite a diverse selection of different clicks that's based on different intonation. So I think it will be interesting for the orchestra to do that.
Okay, I'm going to play one of your orchestra's performances, and then we'll continue with the rest of the interview. All right. So everybody, we are now going to listen to one of the performances of the orchestra that is managed by our guest composer, our guest for today, I beg your pardon. And then we'll continue with the rest of the interview. Thank you. So that's one of the performances by the orchestra that you work with. Quite a short performance, quite interesting. I guess that's what you will define as modern, one style of modern music.
With a strong African element, because it's really all works based by the ancient Khoisan peoples, and it's consisting of 7 miniatures. So this was the fifth part of 7 pieces.
Okay. So just because it contains African instruments, I mean, the story is now changing because it sounds as if it fits into the group of what we call modern music, but that it contains African instruments, does that mean it's no longer modern? Where are we then? What are we talking about?
Well, it doesn't contain any African elements,
Okay.
African instruments at all. I mean,
But
what you saw there is basic percussion and then standard Western instruments.
No, I mean what you said. I thought you said that you kind of used the Western instruments to produce the sound of African sounds.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
But that doesn't invalidate. That doesn't mean it is not modern music.
No, it's definitely modern.
Okay.
But strongly rooted in ancient Africa. So it's really a fusion, I would say.
Sorry, go on. Sorry. So it's a fusion. You can have a fusion. It doesn't matter.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Carry on. Don't let me interrupt you. Sorry.
As I said, he's the Professor Stefans Crevier was the first white South African that started to use African elements. And that was, I think, parallel with the height of apartheid in the 80s, started to become very popular when him and people like Hans Rosenskoen and Professor Jeannie Zeidel Rudolph started to really investigate their own heritage and context within an African and South African milieu. So there was a very strong movement, I think, especially from the early 80s till the 90s, where so-called white composers really investigated and started to study African elements. And I think really became conscious of their own environment and not trying to imitate some form of European nuance. So quite a few composers really had, and as I said, Professor Crevier said he had his Damascus experience when he started to really investigate African fables, African stories, certain intervals, certain combinations of instruments, certain rhythms, and things like that.
It is, I mean, I don't like to discuss, anything to do with politics, and as much as possible avoiding, even recent history as much as possible, especially if it's not part of what you have lived through. But what you are talking about now is a very interesting subject. Talking about, I suppose, Caucasian composers within South Africa who are saying, well, let's look more into where we live and what happens around us. Mm-hmm. So that has to actually actively be done. Is it not an obvious thing that you are an African and perhaps what is around you is part of you? Does it have to be a conscious decision? And to be fair, that applies to a lot of us today, where you have to make a conscious decision to remember who you are, where you are from, and perhaps potential sounds that belong to you that you should not forget or ignore, and you should feel free to explore. Yeah. But it's something that was uncomfortable for them. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with apartheid, which was an illusion. I mean, I grew up still in the height of apartheid.
But it was real.
Sorry?
But it was real. It may have been an illusion, but it had real impacts.
Yes. But the illusion of the white minority was created that we grew up in a kind of a complete isolated vacuum. And I think it's only later at university and later when a lot of us started to think for ourselves. Apartheid started to collapse in 1990, and then I was at my second year at university. But I think as a youngster, you didn't query it. I think, or many people didn't query it. Okay. So I think it really depended on many things. The struggle, the continuous conflict, the continuous criticism towards apartheid as a system, that people really started to investigate. It's a process that came, which the millennials and students of today are maybe not so confronted with. I mean, what fascinates me quite often is that, for example, our vocal department is now at this stage 100% black. And why are they interested in this highly Eurocentric Fach of music and not necessarily in African music? Why is Western opera so extremely attractive
It's
to
what it's
African
because of
music?
what you said earlier, isn't it? I mean, you talked about standard repertoire earlier. Is that not
Yeah,
perhaps the
yeah,
answer?
yeah. So the vocal department focused mainly on standard repertoire. Um, in South Africa, I think there was a very few operas, and then Professor Kumalo at one stage wrote an oratorio. I think it was here in the 80s on Shaka Zulu, which was performed by many South African orchestras. And then there was also another composer, Peter Louis van Dijk, who also wrote a San trilogy group of different works, also focusing and investigating on African elements. But I think that we have a very few South African operas. I think you can count them on two hands. And the majority of the repertoire in the vocal department is mainly Western art music.
And I want to, I guess, stay with the question about history and making a conscious decision to talk about what is around you and the stories around you. Is that necessarily a responsibility? Now I'm sitting in Britain and there are so many ongoing conversations about people's histories and asking questions about identities. There are those who may say, perhaps the Caucasians, I don't like referring to people by their skin color, but okay, that group of people do have history that starts outside of Africa. So they don't necessarily need to talk about, or to feel a responsibility to tell any particular stories because they've got an original history anyway.
Yes.
How do you square this? I mean, I guess it's a topic for a different forum, but it's something that I sometimes wonder, and it's quite a complex topic. You can't just talk about it in the now. It has to be seen in the terms of history. But what you just said now, a few minutes ago, is really interesting, where you said when you were younger, these things were beyond you. They probably never even came up in conversation. And then as you get older, you start to think, wait a minute, something is not balanced here.
Yeah. And I think many South Africans carry a lot of guilt. White, privileged South Africans carry a lot of guilt with that. And I mean, there was endless rhetorics and discussions about it. And even today still, within the South African research SASRM community, there's continuous discussions of what is allowed, what is ethical, what is the correct thing to do. Isn't even ethical for a white composer to investigate traditional African music.
Does it mean questions like cultural appropriation then come up? Are you telling me that comes up?
Yes, very much so.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, very much so. So there's open discussions about it. And I think that's the first step towards healing, is that on an intellectual perspective, you can really discuss and really discuss these things, even if it's sometimes the discussion gets a little bit heated.
Okay. And then you can make progress from there and continue with, working on the music, composing music. And so I guess there is a chance that if a composer who is not a Black South African composes a particular style of work, is there a chance that the work might be rejected because of certain elements, or could have been rejected a long time ago, saying, well, you're not a Black South African, you're not allowed?
But by all means.
Wow, that's interesting. Sorry, go on.
But it's also interesting. We have the first violinist of the Udayan String Quartet. His name is Mr. Samson Diamond. He's coming from Johannesburg, and he's non-Caucasian. Samson Diamond sounds like a very English gentleman. He studied in England, and he's playing in Britain. You must actually investigate to me in an all the Chickener Foundation. Have you ever heard about them? It's a foundation. Sorry. It's a foundation that it's only Africans that play in a Western symphony orchestra.
Right. Okay.
And they are excellent.
Okay.
I think they had a policy change. He told me recently that the orchestra is also open now to other groups, but it was mainly people that was coming from an African background or any other kind of Asian minority. And it's an
That's
excellent
interesting.
orchestra, but they
Okay.
play mainly Western art classical music. Why?
I was going to ask, I was going to say maybe you would not be happy to hear something like that. The thing is, all of these topics, they can get quite involved after a while. For example, there are
Yeah.
those who may say, why would the mandate for an orchestra be for only a particular group of people? If you
Yes.
believe that everybody should, mix, get to know each other, exchange ideas freely, then why should you put a mandate or a criteria up there and say, but listen, we are here to talk about your orchestra, your institute, all the work that you are doing, and you have been doing quite a lot. I mean, performing the works of 25 South African composers since inception it's a huge, significant contribution. Where do you see yourself in the future, along with the orchestra and all the other work that you do? Are you looking at world tours? What's the plan?
Well, excellence is something that you will never achieve, but you're always yearning for. So I'm
There go you,
continuously.
there go you starting to achieve it.
I'm always yearning to 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 achieve a higher standard. And the fact of the matter is, if you look at a so-called conservatory, we in South Africa are compared to Africa, we are very fortunate because we have a certain extent and infrastructure which other African countries might not have. We have this wonderful theaters, which is really sad. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but in the apartheid time, we had 4 arts councils. We had the Art Council in Transvaal, that's in the Johannesburg area, these days called Gauteng. PACT, which stood for the Performing Arts Council Transvaal. Then we had PACOFs that start for the Performing Arts Council Free State. Then we had KPAP that resembled the Cape Arts Council. And then we had another one, NAPAC, that was in Natal. And even though these organizations was created in the apartheid time, it was magnificent structures because each of the structures was also located with a world-class opera house, a drama theater, and a concert hall. Then we had a full symphony orchestra in each of them, a full ballet company, in some cases also a contemporary dance company, a drama company, and a full opera company. And all these structures has been demolished since the year 2000. And the irony was, for example, in the orchestra and the opera company, there was already non-Caucasian people playing in the bands, and also in the opera company, even before apartheid formally collapsed. And it's so sad that these infrastructures, post-apartheid, completely collapsed because the government mothballed it. The State Theatre in Pretoria is a complete mess. The wonderful theatre here in Bloemfontein, the Saint-Duplessis Theatre, is basically used for weddings on a Saturday afternoon. And we have only 2 full professional symphony orchestras left. Then we have the Johannesburg Philharmonic after the collapse, which was founded after the collapse of the National Symphony Orchestra, is not a fully permanent ensemble. So it's obviously professional people, but they play occasionally. So the only remaining professional orchestras is the Cape Town Philharmonic Orchestra and then the KwaZulu-Natal Philharmonic Orchestra. And that's really sad because we have this infrastructure, but it's not utilized.
But I'm sure there have been investigations into why these closed down or collapsed or why they were demolished. What did they find out? Lack of funding? What happened?
Well, of course, the first thing that happened was in the early 2000s, the government withdrew funds from these institutions because they said it's Eurocentric arts.
Is that what, I mean, I don't want to go into politics, but that's an interesting, that was what was given as the reason.
That was what's given as the reason, yes. Okay. And since then, nothing was really done for traditional African music. So we have this wonderful infrastructure, but it's not allocated. The State Theatre, it's basically, I think, the most successful. In fact, I did a little bit of research before our conversation. I would say the Artscape Theatre in Cape Town is the most successful. So they found a model, and they have so-called associated companies within the company. So the government is supporting the Artscape Theatre. Previously, it was known as the Nikumalan Theatre. And within this organization, you have the Cape Town Symphony Orchestra. You have the Cape Town the Cape Town Philharmonic Orchestra, the Cape Town Opera, the Cape Town City Ballet, and the contemporary dance company, the Jazz Art Company. So I think they have a very good model and possible sustainability for the future. Then we have KwaZulu-Natal Philharmonic Orchestra, which is resident in the Playhouse Orchestra. But my critique towards this orchestra is they're playing hardly any works by South African composers and no South African conductors. So they bring third-rate, in my opinion, I'm going to be sacrificed for that. They bring third-rate conductors to conduct a South African composer, a symphony orchestra. And for the first time, we have really South African players. I think they never had a real South African concertmaster. It's always a foreigner.
We were talking about your plans. We're talking about your plans. But before we do that, I mean, this topic has come up again. Topic about standard and gatekeepers and who chooses. Because there are some who will hear what you said and who will say, listen, they are performing the best works out there. Do you need to change the criteria to bring in South African composers specifically?
Obviously.
This is causing a lot of, because you start talking about some call it positive discrimination. You start to hear things like that, but I guess it doesn't fit into that category, does it? Because this is all about supporting the composers from the country. I don't know. It's quite a mixed up conversation now.
Yes.
But I know that I spoke with you a few days ago, and today again, it's coming across really clearly that you are passionate and you want to ensure that as much as possible, the works of South African composers are performed. But then there are those who will say, hello, let's apply the same criteria, and if they don't meet the criteria. So this is it's quite an interesting topic. How do you decide? Who decides?
Well, obviously, I think it depends on the artistic director that's making the artistic decisions. And I think the Cape Town Philharmonic Orchestra found a nice compromise because they started to integrate some works by South African composer in the general symphony seasons. And I think that's really the way to go, because if you continuously perform Rachmaninoff and Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff, and then when you ask, but why don't you perform the works of South African composers? The answer is yes, but people won't come. And that might be the case, irrespective of their racial background. But I think you have a responsibility to start exposing people to their own music, even if it's miniatures. I mean, if you have, let's say, an overture by a South African composer, and the rest you do Rachmaninoff, or you do Tchaikovsky, or Brahms, or Bach, or any of the standard repertoire. But you have to start somewhere, and I think the Cape Town Philharmonic is definitely on the right way, because they give young composers the chance to play music. And before this conversation, I had last night a conversation with Professor Hendrik Hofmeyer, who you had here on your program recently. And he said they even, he had a discussion with them, and they allowed his young composition final year students to have an orchestral reading with the professional symphony orchestra. And then the artistic director was so impressed by the music that he incorporated 2 of the pieces into the symphony season. So I think that's maybe baby steps, but that's really the way to go.
Okay. Finish off with what you have planned for the future. We did not quite hear. We stopped at excellence. You know, you can never reach excellence fully. So please tell us more about your plans. What's happening?
Well, it's difficult times for South Africa because classical music is not healthy. We're in really difficult times, and especially now after the corona, I just read today an article. The Cape Town Philharmonic already had to decrease the people's salaries. So it's difficult times, and I think there need to be serious investigations on what is important and what must be funded by who, when. So we are definitely in an interesting phase, but definitely not an easy phase, because you have also the tendency that young South Africans, irrespective of their racial background, leave the country as soon as possible. And my question to myself is, are we educating young people for the rest of the world? It's definitely problematic if they don't have possibilities here within our continent.
Yes, that is a question that I think quite a few African countries ask themselves. Parents,
Yes.
governments, but especially parents and families invest in their children, educate them as far as and as much as they can, and then the children, in many cases, or in some cases anyway, leave their own country and the continent. So yes, I completely appreciate
and we really need them as role models, especially the young. There's, for example, excellent cellist that's coming from Bloemfontein. He immediately went to America, and then he completed his master's degree in Juilliard School of Music, and now he has a job in New York. But we really need them to come back, and we try to make a compromise in that with our concert season to invite as many as possible young South Africans that have an excellent career abroad as role models. But then there's another dimension. Role models is what? Role models that when you have your education here in South Africa, you leave the country and make a career abroad.
That is very, very important. That's something I wondered
that's
about.
Also really problematic,
yes,
because if we are educating young musicians for the rest of the world, then there's a problem.
That's a very important question. That's a
so
very important
employability and the future to keep them here as young role models is going to be our biggest challenge, I think.
Oh, wow. Like I said, that's a very important question. I've wondered about that myself. For example, what I say is, if somebody stands up in front of a group of children, and wants to encourage them, and the person says, "Work hard," you should check the person who is speaking to you. If the person says, "I worked hard and I became successful," you have to check, because if the person, perhaps, I mean, this is a loose example, but if they were born into wealth and they were given access to that wealth and all the support and all the networks and all the connections, that person cannot tell somebody who was born into abject poverty to work hard to get to where they are, because your advice is not applicable realistically. But yes, exactly. You are absolutely right, because if you look at it another way, coming back and encouraging people and saying, if you work very hard, this and that, what you are telling me is, yeah, work hard, get out of the country, and then you'll be successful. And that's not the message, though. Exactly. So we have to be very careful about it. Yeah, I appreciate it. But then I suppose it's how you shape the message and picking the audience as well. But shaping the message, recognizing that what we want to build, and I don't prevaricate on this point, what we want to build is what is happening in Africa, starting in Africa and developing in Africa and growing, so that more and more of us are encouraged and we are convinced that success can come from Africa. It doesn't have to be on a crutch that is in a foreign country. So absolutely, that's a good, very interesting point. Sorry, I've gone on because that point is really important, to me. Yeah. I really want to talk more about you and what you do. Let's just, spend the next few minutes and I'll just leave it to you now to talk about your dreams, your hopes, how things were when you started, and where you see things going in South Africa with respect to music generally. This is, you just freely speak your mind, because you have put in quite a lot of work. You've seen a lot, and you started a very long time ago. Just give us your thoughts.
Yeah, it's very difficult, and I think it's a very difficult question. I think we must keep it for another time, but I think the post-corona phase is also going to really determine where we are going to pick up now, and how we are going to reinvent and pick up things. So it's difficult, but my aim is for young South Africans not to have a chip on their shoulders, irrespective of their background. And from my perspective, is to give them the best possible education and really enable them to live their dreams, irrespective of where they want to go and do it.
And
in short.
do you get any condemnation for that? Does anybody call you someone who is bringing salvation? How are you viewed as an individual? Let's talk about you now as a person.
Well, I think we're in a very difficult arena, and whenever we have success, we often also have a big fish in a small pond. So it's very important for me as a role model for students to really realistically make them familiar with what international standards are, wherever they want to employ it.
Okay, I think international standards, very important. The word standards, excellence, all of these words have been used today. Thank you very much. Keep up the good work. You have been working at this for a very long time. We have now come to the end of the interview. We can go on and on because it will be wonderful to talk about some stories that you've had, some joys, some disappointments, some failures. I'm sure there have been a few, but some successes as well. But it has been really interesting, meeting you and meeting someone who spent what, decades trying to promote South African composers, working with the South Africans as well. So well done. Keep up the good work. Thank you for your time and for giving us your opinion and talking about history as well of South Africa music from the musical perspective. So thank you very much for your time. Thanks to all those who are watching us live and those who will watch this later.
Thank you very much to you as well. And we will definitely keep contact. There's a few things I would send to you, which we discussed that you might go and investigate that's there in Britain. And you give me a bit of feedback about your opinion. And you are doing very good work. Please keep up. Africa needs you.
Oh, gosh. Okay. Thank you very much. Stay safe, healthy in the midst of everything that's happening now.
And thanks for the opportunity. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.